Today we're going to head to Portugal to see what's done in one of their marine protected areas. So come on, let's check it out. I'm here at the Arrábida Marine Reserve, and I'll give you the formal name in a minute. And I'm here with Yorgos Stratoudakis. So he's going to tell us a little bit about how the Marine Reserve was set up and some of the things involved in the decision-making to set up this reserve.
The name of it is Marine Park Professor Luis Saldaña. Luis Saldaña was a marine biologist that in the 60s did his field work and his diving in Arrábida, so later on they decided to give him the credit of starting research in this place. The process started in the 70s when the terrestrial part of Arrábida where we are became a protected area. Then in the late 90s they decided to extend it to a marine component, and then in 2005 this became official with a special plan and with the regulations that are applied since then. In a way, it's a standalone protected area with reasons that were local, triggered by 2-3 habitats, the coastal habitats that are important. But the National Conservation Institute that is behind this has similar approaches in other parts of the coast with other protected areas. And these habitats are protected along the coast. The other issue is that like 4 or 5 years ago, the government set a task force where I participated as well, asking us to think of a strategy to transform this ad hoc set of protected areas into progressively something that will become a functional network. This little bay was one of the reasons why the park was stimulated, because like 70, 80 years ago, this was a continuous mat of marine plants up to the whole area was covered. They have some military aerial photos from the 1940s, and you see it all covered in black. Now it's whitish because you just have sun most of the spots. Then progressively in the 60s, in the 70s, you start creating little holes by the anchors of the few boats that were there. As you got more sailing boats, it got bigger the holes and narrower the patches. Then you got dredgers that also interfered. And then some storms really destroyed the remains of the mats you still had there. The underlying objective is preserve the conservation state of the place. In the marine component, it's at the transition area between two biogeographical zones, so you get some of the more of the warmer fauna and the cooler fauna depending on the season and the heating up, and you get 3 or 4 important coastal habitats: the rocky littoral, the sandy littoral, and the submerged caves that all exist in this area. So the main objective was to protect these habitats. But there is a secondary objective that is stated in the decree, that is to promote sustainable development of local activities. So the local fishermen see it as something that was promised and was not delivered so far.
Is there a way to do that sustainably for this place?
It is difficult. First of all, we're speaking about a rather narrow area that is difficult, and you get at least 10% of it that is a full reserve, so nobody can enter. Then you have about 35% of it that you get only pots and jigs, so very minor static fishing gear. And then the rest, you can have complementary fishing activities, but still few fishermen can really live from it. They still have to go outside as well, or have to do other things to make a living. And so far, the value of the fish that is extracted from the reserve has no added value in relation to the remaining fish.
So are there some specific regulations in how this is managed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. First, since 2005, you have a specific zonation that divides the areas of the marine park into no entry zones, areas where very few non-extractive activities are permitted, and areas where you still can have some small-scale fishing. The second important regulation was that any vessel larger than 7 meters was excluded from the reserve. So only very small boats that come from a local harbor can operate within this area. So even Setúbal, that is next door, small boats from Setúbal cannot enter into this marine reserve. Only vessels from Sesimbra may operate within it. And then you had the exclusion of spearfishing, and now you have only designated areas where you can anchor, and you have buoys in the remaining areas where you can only temporarily attach your vessel rather than use your own anchor. And the full reserve is also prohibited for diving, even for entry, I think, for the vessels to pass through.
So next I want to understand is how science and research is taken up in this park or
Yeah.
used.
The first thing is to notice that even the name of the park has the name of a biology professor that started doing biological research, taxonomic, but also ecological in the 60s. So Luis Saldaña is not alive anymore, but it was a tribute paid to him. Then before the setting up of the marine park, you already had some diving monitoring exercises that demonstrated that along a decade actually, and this is published, that showed that you have this transition area between two geographical regions with fauna changing depending on winter weather conditions. And after that, yes, you do have plenty of, of support towards research by the administration of this marine area, but is likely on an ad hoc basis. So you get different university groups that do different components of research on whenever they get funding. So there's no continuity in the process, and I would even say there's some competition or overlap. So you don't have a regular monitoring, and you try to patch up from the various projects notions of evolution in the system. At some stage, my institute also got involved and did some systematic mapping of the habitats within the protected area, and there was a longer project that was involving funded components and then voluntary intermediate elements, where for a decade we tried to gear up participation, understand what was the main complaints, and try to create better relations between stakeholders and administration. And again, we tried to publish this after a decade. Some progress was made, but then things again died down, and now for some years there has not been any additional movements, and I'm not anywhere involved now with it. One important thing that I would like, that was not in the questions, that I think is relevant to say, actually there are two things from my experience in these 10 years I interacted, 10, 15 years. One is that when you set up tighter regulations and you do not have equivalent tightening up on control, what you end up doing is create more rules for a majority and give more space to a non-compliant minority. So you end up eventually increasing social asymmetries, because you have a majority that gets suppressed, a minority that expands, and the hiatus between them becomes bigger, and you get more dissatisfaction out of this process. Irrespective if the reasons of putting the rules were right, if you cannot enforce them sufficiently, you end up getting this unevenness. And the second that was pretty specific of this area, that I got it when I did some questionnaires and interviews with them, is that apart from this thing I was telling you of the marine plants that you had in this bay, up to the early 90s, further on the west, on the most exposed regions, you had large kelp forests. similar to the one you get in California. And anybody that has more than 30, 40 years would tell me, when I was a kid, I was afraid to go in there because it was like
Forest of kelp.
yes, and dense, and big animals would, and a crab would crawl on me suddenly. So the notion of biodiversity, of productivity, and of richness was associated to that. And this disappeared before the creation of the park. So this created to them two negative notions about the park. One is that it was not fishermen that drained this biodiversity hotspot, and their standard of what is a biodiverse system goes back to that reference. So any improvement done afterwards on the starting point is still below what they have as a reference that was happening before. So this has created a general negative local tendency towards the park, despite the clear evidence that things are improving since it has started. Yep.
All right, Yorgos. Well, I want to thank you very much for taking
My
your time
pleasure.
to explain some of this and how things are done here in
Mm-hmm.
Portugal, at least with this reserve.
Yep.
It's very exciting. So again, thank you very much.